please pick that material up. I'm a professor at Duke Law School, and we have a group of folks from Duke Law School and also other institutions here today. But before we begin all that, we have a couple of logistical announcements, and then I would like to introduce our honored speaker, Senator Chris Coons. There are two logistical announcements in particular. Lunch is back there. You should feel free to get it at any point during our event. In addition, the speakers for our event will be coming up sequentially to give short talks after every speaker has spoken, the panel speakers, that is. We will then all convene as a group to have a panel discussion together with engagement with the audience. So those are the two logistical announcements. And now I am delighted to introduce Senator Coons. Probably needs no introduction, but as you know, he is a senator from Delaware who was elected in 2010 following terms as the Newcastle County Council President and Newcastle County Executive. In the Senate, he sits on numerous important committees, including Appropriations, Judiciary, Foreign Relations, Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and Ethics. Senator Coons has made manufacturing and innovation, the subjects of our discussion today, top legislative priorities in the Senate. He co-founded the Bipartisan Senate Competitiveness Caucus and co-chairs the Manufacturing Jobs for America initiative, two efforts that have attracted participation from dozens of senators of both parties. Senator Coons has authored numerous pro-innovation bills that have been signed into law, including a permanent extension of the R&D tax credits for startups and small businesses, as well as the Defend Trade Secrets Act, which creates new federal protections for intellectual property. Before entering government, Senator Coons spent 8 years working for an advanced materials manufacturer in Delaware. So without further ado, Senator Coons.
Well, thank you, Arti, and thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedules to serve on a fantastic panel, to listen to their wisdom, and to contemplate our common topic today, the declining research, should we worry? I know I will reveal no great state secrets by saying yes. I think we're done now. Are we done? To the panel that is about to present, let me just say my thanks to Stephen Merrill's leadership at the Center for Innovation Policy. You've put together a terrific panel of experts with an important and timely topic. To Wesley Cohen, to Ashish Arora, to Pian, thank you for your work on the economics of innovation. And to Stephen Freilich, thank you both for being a good companion on the train ride down from Wilmington this morning, and for all you've done over the decades at DuPont. Congratulations on your new position as Director of Corporate Strategy at the University of Delaware's Energy Institute. So I know you have a far more substantive, thoughtful, and learned panel to immediately follow me. I'm really to distract you while you eat lunch, so feel free to keep eating, and I'll try to be distracting, if not engaging. We are here to discuss not just should we worry, but what should we do about it. It is clear the answer to both questions unequivocally is yes. Yes, because a strong R&D investment is a key component of a robust innovation ecosystem. Yes, because more and more U.S. firms are performing R&D abroad. In fact, in 2015, over a third of all R&D for U.S. firms was performed in Asia, a 30% increase from 2007. And yes, because the Trump budget proposes significant reductions, across-the-board cuts, really, in federal research, jeopardizing our long-term competitiveness. Why would we be cutting research and development when it is so important to job creation and economic growth? No administration, Republican or Democrat, in 40 years has been more hostile towards federal research and development than this one. The Trump budget cuts non-defense R&D by more than $14 billion, or nearly 20%, in their proposed FY18 budget. It cuts the NIH, which is essential to advances in all sorts of critical areas of science, cures, and treatments, not least of which is the search for cures for cancer. And it cuts the NIH budget by 18%. It cuts Manufacturing USA, a vital set of institutes aimed at boosting domestic manufacturing and tying innovations in new cutting-edge areas of science to the development of new capacities in manufacturing. It cuts that by more than 70%, eliminating all 5 of the Department of Energy-run institutes. It cuts energy programs at the Department of Energy by 60%. And basic science research funding at the National Science Foundation, or NSF, by 11%. The good news is that both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate have already said that this budget is dead on arrival in this Congress. But the devil will be in the details. And the administration may not achieve the dramatic cuts that they propose in federal R&D, but they may succeed in significant, sustained, and across-the-board reductions, a reduction in the rate of growth or a reduction across the board. Either would be a negative outcome for our whole country. Budgets, as my predecessor Joe Biden long said, is an expression of your values and priorities as a country. And Congress doesn't share this administration's values or priorities when it comes to investing in basic and applied science to try and find solutions to the very real problems that affect Americans day in and day out, whether it's in healthcare and diseases or it's in energy and transportation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be deeply worried about the impact of these massive proposed cuts and, more importantly, long-term uncertainty when it comes to federal investments in R&D. Investments in R&D are vital to our economy. One study of 15 leading economies globally showed that a $1 investment in R&D generated more than $20 in economic activity. Even taking into account private sector investment, as a country, we still significantly lag behind our competitors around the world in R&D investment. One recent ranking of total R&D spending as a percentage of GDP places the United States not first, not second, not third, but today in 10th place, even though our economy is nearly twice as large as all of the other countries that outrank us combined. We understand the importance of federal support for R&D and what these investments mean for our economy and for our future, but many others, particularly here in Congress, may not. It is on us to help the federal government advocate for R&D and to help the American people appreciate the strong link between federal investment in R&D and economic growth, job creation, and quality of life. Let me make one other side point that's small but significant. I was a major in chemistry in college, and I still remember as my classmates were making decisions going into graduate school, whether to pursue a career in physics or in chemistry or in engineering. And the signal at the time, this was the Reagan administration, was that there were dramatic increases in investment in defense-related R&D. So a number of folks who had a choice went into physics, knowing that it would be funded for the long term, and chose not to go into chemistry or biochemistry, believing it would not be funded for the long term. An entire generation of graduate students and researchers, of professors and those who will lead innovation for the next generation are making career decisions today. And if all you see is a march for science on the Mall out of desperation and alarming news that there are dramatic cuts coming in federal R&D investment, how many of the most promising researchers for this next generation will take the off-ramp and instead choose some completely different path or career? These cuts have long-term consequences. So there's a case we have to make to the American people, a case that investment in R&D makes us more competitive, will grow our economy, and will give a higher quality of life to future Americans. Why am I at all optimistic this is a debate we can win? It's not just because the Trump budget has rallied both Democrats and Republicans to stand up for key U.S. investments at home and around the world. I'm also optimistic because despite the very partisan, very difficult, very divided political environment here in Congress, I've gotten some real legislative actions enacted into law. as you heard in the introduction by Arti, an expanded permanent R&D tax credit for startups and small businesses, a new federal right of action for defending trade secrets, an improvement for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, and a stronger I-Corps program within the NSF. I'm optimistic because in each of these cases I have found a Republican willing to work together to legislate, and they have been signed into law. Each of the laws I just named had Republican co-sponsors, was passed by a Republican House, and signed into law by a Democratic president. In fact, literally today, I am introducing the Invent and Manufacture in America Act with conservative Republican Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas, which increases the R&D tax credit for companies that don't just design or research or develop a product, but they also manufacture it in the United States. As I've often said in my home state of Delaware, how much of the guts of this was designed, researched, and developed in the United States? How many of these are manufactured in the United States? If we can have more of what is invented here, manufactured here, we will have a stronger future as a country. So it can be done. But these types of victories aren't going to materialize magically in Congress without your support. You have to work with us to convince this administration and many in this Congress that investments in science, in R&D, and in innovation deeply matter to our security, our prosperity, and our future. So frankly, be persistent and loud. Assume nothing. Explain what R&D means for the American people, and lean on your Republican members, those of you who work in Congress, your Democratic members, and your allies in the administration. With your advocacy and engagement, I believe it is possible to not just sustain but grow federal investment R&D and to improve the policy framework for our future competitiveness and innovation. Thank you very much. Have a great conference, and thank you again to the panel.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Thank you again, Senator Coons. Well, that was a rousing start to what I think will be a very exciting panel. We will be moderated, if we can be moderated, 5 professors and 1 ex-R&D leader, by Wesley Cohen, who is himself a professor at the Fuqua School of Business, and he is one of the world's leading authorities on innovation and entrepreneurship. His research on the economics of technological change and R&D has really literally changed the course of many debates in the area. The first panel speaker will be Ashish Arora, his colleague at Duke's Fuqua Business School. Professor Arora is the Rex Adams Professor of Business Administration, and I think it's fair to say that he, too, his work as well, has changed the debate on questions of technological change. He also, Professor Arora is also co-editor, or was recently stepped down as a co-editor of the leading journal in this area, Research Policy. So I will invite both Professor Cohen and Professor Arora up here, and Professor Arora will start the panel.
Very good. Just a couple of introductory points here, points of order. We will proceed sequentially through the speakers, who will each come up in turn, and each speaker is allotted 10 minutes. I am the official timekeeper, and that is to allow for plenty of time for engagement and interaction, Q&A, and so on. So that's really our objective. We really look forward to hearing from you all once the speakers have finished their remarks. So with that, the very eminent Professor Arora, please take it away.
Thank you. Good morning. The title of what I want to say is right there, which is I'm going to talk about. We talk about R&D all the time as if they were one word. I want to break those apart and talk about research in research and development, and specifically what the corporate sector is doing. So these data are from the National Science Foundation. It's a busy chart. This bar these gray bars, is real, that is to say, adjusted for inflation, basic and applied research funded and performed by the business sector in the United States. You can see that it's been roughly constant, flat, over the last 10, 15 years. So this is in absolute terms, even while the economy has grown by about 60% or more, real spending on research by the business sector is flat. Those two lines tell you the same story as percentages. This is the share of business in total research. Sorry, make sure I'm saying this right. Yes, this is the share of business in total research, and you can see that's fallen, and this is the share of research and business R&D. So how of every dollar that business spends on R&D, what fraction goes to research, and that's steadily fallen. So the takeaway here, and you'll see this repeatedly, is less R, more D, or less R in R&D, if you want to be precise. This is the same story, different kinds of data. I showed you NSF statistics. These are data that Sharon Bellinzon and I have put together, where we matched corporate publications, scientific output, and they tell you the same story. Even while patents have increased, that's the blue line, publication output has fallen when you normalize it per firm or normalize it for size. And this is the same story in terms of publication output by different fields. And the point of this picture is the decline that the NSF number shows, you can see using a different measure, namely scientific publications. You see the same results if you do the appropriate controls, adjusting for the fact, for example, that some companies may have declined in business. So a company like, for example, Kodak does much less manufacturing than it used to and is much smaller than it used to be, so you'd expect that decline to take place. Once you adjust for all of that, you still get the same result, right? So it's just different ways of making the same point, less R, more D. This is NSF data, once again, looking across sectors. So the point here is these trends are broad-based. They're not driven by a particular sector. So we all have our pet stories about, oh, this happened in IT or that happened in semiconductors or computers. Across a range of sectors, you still see the same effects. Here's something that we could do because we were able to match publication output at the firm level. What this tells you is, so let's start with this. This is the value or the stock market premium companies used to get from 1980 up until mid-90s. This is the premium they would get for being engaged in research. So formally, it's the premium for having publication. That's the way we measured it. And this is the same. The premium for having patents was basically zero. The next half of the sample, starting 1996, you see that the premium on research disappears. A similar story happens if you look at the premium paid in M&A when you have acquisitions. There used to be a premium if you were being acquired for doing research. Now there is none. Now the premium is mostly, the patent premium remains, the research premium is gone. What's the point? The point here is that the decline that you saw in research output is consistent with a decline in the private value of science or the private value of research. Managers, investors don't put the same value on the company performing research. That's what the facts say. Why that is so is a separate inquiry. You'll hear more about it. But here's that's what the facts are. A quick side note. There's been a great deal of hope expressed that startups will pick up some of the slack in terms of large firms withdrawing from research, and the story could be small firms that will do it. The short answer is no. If you look at this line, that's patents, lots of patenting from startups, much less research. This is per firm, that's total. Sorry, this is per firm, that's total. Whichever way you look at it, small firms, startups, they're not going to be able to pick up the slack. In fact, if anything, from what I know about VCs, we'll see less research from startups in the future. VCs don't want to be investing in that in research. Okay. So one inference you could draw is, well, maybe we're investing less in research because research is less useful for corporate inventions. So one reason it could be that's why they're cutting back. And the answer here is no. How do we measure usefulness? What we're using is citations made by patents, corporate patents, to the scientific literature. These are called non-patent references. We've done it more precisely than that. We've literally matched it to actual publications of the Web of Science. Whichever way you do it, you look at it. This line says the average age. So this line says you're citing more science, not less. And moreover, the science that you're citing is not older. It's got the same recency. Right? So if you take a patent a year that's issued a year from now, the average age of the science cited will be a year less. What's the takeaway? Science continues to be useful. Research continues to be useful for corporate invention. Right? These are corporate patents that are doing it. So corporations are using more science, not less, and they're producing less of it. They're investing less of it. They're producing less of it. And so where is the science that they're using coming from? It's coming from the outside, mostly publicly funded research by other companies. That could be a part of the story. So that's, if you like, that's the point here. So I can now just summarize what I think we've found. This has been mostly just the facts. I've not put any interpretation or much interpretation. So what are the facts? The facts are companies are doing less research, particularly clearly as a fraction of their R&D. And even in absolute amounts, they're not doing more over the last 10, 15 years, whereas the economy has expanded by a considerable point. This gap, and private sector research is still a big chunk of research. It's over 30%. So there is a gap. This gap will not be filled by startups. VCs are not going to come in to save the day. Whoops. Well, that wasn't good. Research continues to be very valuable, and companies continue to use science in their inventions, and they're relying on outside science. Now, interpretation, this is as yet not fully backed up by evidence. So, there are many different interpretations you'll hear today. Here's the one Sharon and I subscribe to, which is what we're seeing is a growing division of labor between the university sector and the corporate sector, where increasingly corporations are going to rely on universities, government labs, publicly funded research to do the basic science, to do that's needed, and will use it. And some of it may be mediated by startups. Okay. The policy implications, I think, are quite clear. Companies are not going to do it. Startups are not going to do it. The only real source for this is public support for research. If we don't have this, this proposed division of labor just will not work. Right? So these budget cuts that were discussed, I think, come at a particularly bad time in terms of these data. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ashish. Very good. We will now hear from Stephen Merrill, who was the longtime head of the National Academy of Science, Technology, and Economic Policy Board. We were very fortunate to have Steve join Duke as the executive director of the Center for Innovation Policy. Stephen has worked obviously for decades on innovation policy and has been really an instrumental player in any number of policies, including notably the America Invents Act. With that, I introduce Steve Merrill. Please, Steve.
Thank you very much, Wes. So it's my job to talk about the public investment picture in 10 minutes. And it won't surprise any of you that federal government spending on R&D is flat or declining. In fact, as a share or ratio of federal R&D to GDP, with the exception of 1 year, it's at the lowest it's been since we began keeping track in the early 1950s. And with the proposed budget cuts that the senator described of 11%, 13%, 17%, 22%, my back of the envelope calculation is that the ratio would drop from about 0.75 to 0.6 in fiscal year 2018. So all the concern about the overall science budget and the proposed cuts to individual agencies is entirely appropriate. But I want to focus my remarks on one important variant of this issue that I think may be lost or may be subordinated in this debate. So economists have shown that investments in ICT, information and communications technology, were a major contributor to the economic growth and productivity spurts that occurred in the 1990s and 2000s. These investments were in turn dependent on physical science and engineering research investments in the 1960s and 1970s that enabled this spending on hardware and software. But since 1980, public support of physical science and engineering research has stagnated or actually declined, in contrast to admittedly irregular but substantial growth in the life sciences. And I'm using entirely NSF data, and like Ashish, I'm talking about research, basic and applied research as distinct from development. So if you look at the broad fields over this 35-year period, physical science and engineering research used to represent more than 40% of the federal portfolio. But in 2015, that was down to a little more than a quarter. And here you see what has happened to particular subfields of research. I didn't choose this set of 6 fields: biology, medical science, computer science, materials, electrical engineering, and chemistry. I didn't choose that subset of about 35 fields purely arbitrarily or to prove a point. Instead, I relied on work that Wes has done earlier by surveying R&D managers in manufacturing firms and asking them what fields of science did they depend on for the productivity of their work in industry. And these were the 6 fields that were identified by those respondents. So you can see what happened to biology and medicine over this 35-year period. They tripled in real terms. Computer science and material science have also increased, but from a very small base. But chemistry and electrical engineering have actually declined in real terms. Chemistry by 11% and electrical engineering by 4%. Imagine we're spending less in 2015 on electrical engineering than we were in real terms in 1980. Now, of course, university research is an important component of this. And we know that university research derives support from other sources than the federal government. Principally three sources. One, and the most rapidly growing, is the funds of the institution performing the research. Those funds drawn from a variety of sources, from tuition, from grants, from individual donors, and so forth. That represents almost 25% of university funding of R&D. Now, in this case, I'm talking about R&D, but 90% of that is basic and applied research. The other sources are much smaller. Nonprofit institutions, principally foundations, and business investment in university research. So the question arises, have they helped rebalance funding? No. They've been even more heavily weighted toward the life sciences. One recent informal survey of universities by a consortium of foundations asked what their individual donor and foundation support went to, and they reported that last year 84% of it went to the life sciences. So I call this an imbalance. What do I mean? What do I mean literally by imbalance? That there has been negligible growth in physical science and engineering support, while life sciences support has generally been keeping up with the growth of the economy. Now, this is not a new problem, has not suddenly been recognized as a problem. In fact, there's been a decade of effort to rebalance the federal portfolio, beginning with the Competes Act of 2007 and its reauthorizations in 2010 and 2017. The original act proposed to double the support of physical sciences and engineering through the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Office of Science, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The 2010 reauthorization reduced those figures somewhat, and the 2017 reauthorization abandoned the effort to double those fields' support. So this is the depiction of the Congressional Research Service of how this effort has largely dissipated, largely been a failure. First of all, because it focused on authorizations, and the similar effort was not applied to in the appropriations process, but now even the authorization route has been largely abandoned. Now, there have been a succession of White House S&T initiatives during the period of the 2000s. Not all of those, I emphasize, have been focused on research. A lot of them on things like STEM education, commercialization of results of research, and other aspects of S&T. But, and a number of them have been in the physical sciences and engineering, a couple in the life sciences. But I think this slide illustrates why it's far more complicated to design the growth of physical sciences and engineering than it is to boost the budget of the National Institutes of Health quite apart from the fact that biomedical research enjoys popular and political support to a greater extent. There are more agencies involved with more diverse sources of support and of operation, I should say, in-house laboratories, competitive grants, external contracts, FFRDCs. And importantly, these programs are subject to at least 3 appropriation subcommittees in each house rather than the single appropriation subcommittee that handles the NIH budget. Now, today, in addition to addressing the challenges that the senator described, I think we should address the question of the health of physical science and engineering research. We could do this in part through the rebuilding of the military and the nation's infrastructure. Those could be opportunities, could be vehicles for rebalancing the federal research portfolio. But that will not depend solely on the agencies responsible. Unlike NIH, the physical science supporting agencies generally don't see as their mission the health of the fields of research they support. So it depends on a functioning Office of Science and Technology in the White House and a technologically sophisticated National Economic Council. Unfortunately, we don't appear to be on the road toward either of those.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Very good. We will now hear from Stephen Freilich. Steve has a PhD in chemistry from Harvard and is currently the director of corporate strategy for the University of Delaware's Energy Institute. He recently retired from DuPont after a 33-year career in both research and business leadership, and for the last 12 years of his tenure there, served as Director of Materials Science in the DuPont Central Research and Development Center there. And this is, so clearly Stephen has a view of the issues that we're talking about from the viewpoint of industry and a terribly important domain, particularly materials science. With that, Stephen, please.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a little microcosm view of this. It's not going to be so much data-rich as what you've seen, but I'm going to tell you what I've observed in the materials businesses, an industry that's actually incredibly important to the U.S. economy. It amounts to about 3% of the value add to the GDP, and between direct and indirect jobs, employs about 9 million people. So this is a very vital industry that's been extraordinarily successful over the last 100 years, because what it does is differentiate the products through innovation led by science. Now, there are 3 things that a materials company needs to do in order to have science be an important part of its business model. The first of these is that it has to be comfortable with managing uncertainty. And it does this by having a balanced portfolio that is balanced in risk, time, and reward, so that you can absorb both the psychological and financial implications of the inevitable failures that portfolio will exhibit. Second of all, the industry has to understand that innovation happens at the intersection of what's known and what's not known. And it's bringing those things together that gives you something new that you can create, but it's very important that you can, at the very front end of your knowledge process, be able to sense what's going on both new inside your company and what's going on in the outside environment, and then to be able to integrate that across your business units as appropriate, but really across that entire chain of knowledge development, from research to invention, ultimately to manufacturing and sales. But the markets have not been particularly kind to the materials and chemistry industry of late. If we look at data from McKinsey for 2004 to 2014, what we see very clearly is that the margins have been incredibly squeezed as products become more rapidly commoditized. Now, that drives corporate leadership to make a couple of decisions, one of which is to begin to think about research less as the investment that it really is, and more to think about it as a cost. And the other thing that it does is drive a very short-term vision towards growth, and we get these financial gimmicks of things like share buybacks to give the appearance of growth when real growth is not actually happening. Now, this idea of short-term view is not without its merit. If you look at at what it takes to do true innovation, where you're dealing with new technology that is being implemented in your product line, you can see from these data that involve polling of a tremendous number of materials and chemical companies, you can see that the success rates are low as 15%. And the times to commercialization are as long as 20 years. And that's going to challenge the patience of most boardrooms. So what do? Well, they become more focused on their existing products within their existing businesses and spend less of their research dollars thinking about how they can create something new, because that's significantly more risky. So while the R&D budget may be cut by what will be considered to be a modest 10, 20, maybe 30%, what's more important is that, as you heard earlier, the shift is away from discovering the new and more towards application development, incremental changes in existing products. And those are very low risk, but they're also low reward, and the value of them disappears relatively quickly. But when you do that, there's a great advantage that you have. You can eliminate the front end of this knowledge value chain. The implications of that are pretty significant, though, because it violates the fundamentals that make science a part of your business. You now find it much harder to go from discovery to innovation because there's nothing at the beginning to either sense what's going on or to incorporate it and prototype it into manufacturing. You also reduce the ability to attract new talent and their new ideas. You heard Senator Coons talk about the decisions that he made when he got out of college about where he wanted to spend his time. The same thing is happening today in the materials world. People look around, they see DuPont, Kodak, General Electric, Dow reducing their basic R&D. Where are they going to go? They're going to choose different careers. And finally, and as I've mentioned before, this ability to sense what's going on in the early stages of development outside your own walls begins to dissipate when there's nobody there watching anymore. Now, as you heard earlier, one of the potential solutions that has been brought up is venture capital. And people have said, look, startups, university spinoffs, they can do the invention, we'll do the innovation by absorbing it. Yet again, without that front end, you can't find it as quickly as you need to, and that actually raises your risk profile. Secondarily, venture capital isn't a solution either, because venture capital likes to get in and out on an average of a 3 to 5 year period for their investment. Remember the time periods we're talking about for developing products within material science. So if you look at where venture capital has put their money over the last 20 years, it's gone the way of biotech and software, where you can either make sexy hits or quick hits, and not so much in the industrial and engineering space. And by the way, these numbers are coming from the National Venture Capital Association. And when I'm talking about industrial and energy, this includes things like mining, oil, things like that, well outside the material space as well. For materials alone, it's significantly worse than this. So no one is there to bridge the so-called valley of death that exists between the invention and the commercialization of a new product. Now, I've given you a rather bleak picture of the ghost of things past and the ghost of things present. Let me try to uplift now, assuming that isn't a fire alarm, let me try to uplift now with the way that it does, the way that it can be, because what I've just outlined does not have to be the future. And I'll give you an example of something in the solar industry. We all know that manufacturing of solar modules has evolved away from the U.S., where it was invented, and gone almost exclusively to Asia, particularly in China. And some brilliant work that was done by Goodrich at National Renewable Energy Lab has investigated why did this happen. And it's not for those things that you hear in the political dialogue. It's not about low-cost manufacturing because of low labor costs. It's not about the government interceding and cutting costs for everybody in the industry to make China look better. It actually is because that they built to scale of the market, and they made their supply chain scale and price with the industry that they hope to create. So while that says there's not much you can do about that if you want to compete in that technology, the way you solve this is, in fact, through innovation. Again, going back to this Goodrich article, what they did was then model a much improved, higher efficiency solar panel and assume that in the U.S. you manufacture to scale and you have the supply chain manufacture to meet up with that scale. The identical technology in China competes with the U.S. almost head-to-head at this point, and that's before you take into account the shipping costs of shipping glass from China to the U.S. What this does is show an important role for the government here, not only in reducing the private sector risk of that innovation that you've now required, but also in bringing the parties together across the supply chain, similar to what is done in DARPA, where it's not just inventing something, but bringing all the pieces together to make sure that the military can actually have the product in the form that it wants to have. And this is done, of course, through public-private partnerships. So in conclusion, what I'd like to emphasize is the fact that the short-term focus has very serious implications on the impact of science as a way of driving innovation. We're separating innovation from manufacture, never a good idea, and it reduces the ability to have science impact innovation. You've crippled the front end through some of these short-term decisions about where to put your research dollars, and that increases the depth and the width of the valley of death. It also underscores the very important role that the federal government has played historically and needs to continue to play despite all of the headwinds that we've heard about, with the government taking the position of reducing private sector risk. I want to emphasize this. This is not about the government doing those things that the private sector can do better. It is not about the government picking winners. What this is the government saying this is important to the national interest, and we are going to invest in those things that the private sector cannot and will not do to help the private sector enable this country to compete. And finally, part of that is not only driving the basic science that's so important to forming the foundation of innovation through organizations like the NSF, DOE, and DARPA, but also in having thoughtful public-private partnerships that drive innovation across the supply chain to create U.S. jobs. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you very much. And next we will hear from Pian Xu. Pian received her PhD in economics from MIT. She is currently a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School and is a visiting scholar this year at MIT Sloan School of Management. And with that, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about my research on the impact of foreign competition on domestic innovation in the U.S. And this is joint work with a series of co-authors at MIT, Zurich, UCSD, and Harvard Business School. So I want to start by providing motivating evidence why manufacturing is still important to the U.S. economy. So despite the fact that manufacturing only accounts for less than 10% of the U.S. employment now, it's still a very strong locus of U.S. innovation. So even in recent years, the U.S. manufacturing firms still account for more than 2/3 of the U.S. corporate R&D and 3/4 of U.S. corporate patents. So innovation efforts in manufacturing sector are important, and it's very important to understand the potential forces that could influence firms' incentives or capability to pursue innovations. And in the past couple of decades, there were, I would say, two strong trends that really profoundly influenced the manufacturing sector. The first is the skill-biased technological change, where a lot of routine manufacturing jobs are replaced by automation. And the second one is globalization, the fact that you can have imports from countries with cheap labor, such as China. Oops, that picture didn't show up correctly there. And the impact of globalization on innovation in the U.S. is the primary motivation of our study. So in particular, we want to look at the impact of the increasing import competition from China. So over the past, from 1991 to 2011, you can see on this graph that the share of world manufacturing exports from China grew from 2% in 91 to over 14% in 2011. So that's like a 7-fold increase. And we as consumers can pretty much feel the impact, right? If we just go to Walmart, Costco, any of the supermarkets, we can see a lot of goods both from China and made in China. So we can feel the impact of this rise of Chinese export as consumers, but I think more importantly, in this research, we want to ask what is the impact of that rising import competition on domestic manufacturing firms in the U.S. And in theory, that impact could be ambiguous. So on the one hand, a little bit of competition could be very good for innovation because it gives firms more incentive to innovate their way out of the competition, right, to run ahead of the curve. But on the other hand, if you have a lot of competition, it also squeezes profit margin and decreases the incentives to innovate because you're not making as much money anymore in the same space. So ultimately, it's an empirical question. So in our study, we empirically matched the trade data to firm data, and we look at large U.S. firms that are listed in North America stock markets. So these are our sample is large U.S. firms, and specifically we want to compare within the same large broad sectors such as chemicals, computing sectors. How does different industries which experienced different degrees of changing import exposure, how do they change in terms of their growth in the patenting effort? So that's our key outcome, which is patents. And we also look at other outcomes such as R&D expenses, sales employment, etc. So our main finding is that within broad sectors, industries that faced more import competition showed a significant decline in their patenting. And within industry, if you just compare within the industry over time, this increase in import competition from China could explain about 15 to 25% of the decline in patenting over the two period, which is 91 to 99 and 99 to 2007. So it's a non-trivial effect. And in particular, we also find, more specifically, we also find that these trade-exposed U.S. industries also experienced declining employment, sales, profit, etc. So it's a downscale across all margins, not just the innovation output. And this effect most negatively affect the companies you could call that were kind of lagging behind, so the ones that were initially less profitable and more indebted at the beginning. So to going back to the theory, we basically find that the negative side of the effect dominates. And why that's the case, and I want to go back and sort of put the results in a broader context of the rise of China. So I think there are a few features of the Chinese rising exports that are important for understanding the results. The first is that the timing of China's rise was quite unexpected. So in in early 80s, President Deng Xiaoping decided to open up the border and start the transition to a market economy. And whether that effort could be successful or not, I think was viewed as quite uncertain at the time. In fact, Wall Street Journal had a discussion of in '89. Wall Street Journal wrote an article about predicting the new growing economy in the new decades, and they ranked China actually as the bottom of the countries that are expected to grow in the next 10 years. So boy, was they wrong about that. And the second part is that the degree of the rise was also quite unexpected, and that's because of the World War II and then the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution that all happened within about 50 years span in China. China was really far from its production frontier, which means when they decide to catch up, they have a lot of room to grow. And that could partially seen on the graph, as you can see this dramatic increase. And the last is that because of its population, China has huge competitive advantage in cheap labor and manufacturing, and thus the manufacturing sector was experienced most of the shock. So how do we want to interpret the result? I think these results highlight the complicated effects of globalization. And in particular, I think it speaks to two potential sources of negative impact on competition. The first one is that when you get hit by a surge of foreign competition, especially to a large degree, it really could hurt unprepared domestic firms. And it hurts them not only in the innovation margin, but also all across, the production margin, profit margin, all across. And the second, which is something I didn't highlight in this presentation, but I do want to bring up because Senator Coons also talked about it, is that the ability to offshore to China and other developing countries gives you some immediate benefits of cost saving. But in the long term, it could also hurt the innovation process because the decoupling of manufacturing and R&D could be detrimental to the innovation process, especially in industries where there's a lot of the synergy between the two. We don't suspect this to be the primary explanation of our results, but I think this is also definitely at play here. I don't think our results suggest that protectionism is an answer. It's not that we want to shut out these competition, because you can't. And more importantly, there are many benefits of globalization that we at this empirical study did not focus. So we specifically look at the impact of import competition, but we didn't look at the impact of, for instance, as part of globalization, firms in the U.S. also have market access to Chinese consumers in other countries, and that could be very beneficial both for the firm's profit as well as their incentives to innovate. But I think the solar panel example from the last presentation was spot on, which really shows that the way to counter competition is not through trying to shut them down, but it really speaks to the ever more importance of effort to strengthen the innovation. And I think it really shows how important innovation are and R&D efforts are to the core of U.S. competitiveness. So I want to echo Ashish's point about the importance of policy effort to strengthen U.S. competitiveness through R&D and innovation and private and public partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pian. And our last speaker will be Arti. She introduced herself, but not sufficiently, in my view. She is the Laddie Professor of Law at Duke, and what she neglected to say is that she is truly an internationally recognized expert in intellectual property law, innovation policy, and administrative law. She's taught not only at Duke, but Harvard, Yale, and Penn, and she is took time out from her academic career to serve as the administrator of the Office of External Affairs at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office 2009 to 10, and was instrumental in the analysis underpinning the patent reform legislation that became the America Invents Act in 2011. With that, Arti, we are pleased to hear you. And Arti, I should also say, will not only be summarizing what we've said, but also really speak to the policy levers that might be considered when we think about, what should be done. Thank you. Please.
Thanks, Wes. So I will try to summarize very quickly. No need to go into great detail because our speakers were so excellent in summarizing their own work. But I think it's fair to say that our speakers made it clear, Ashish started out with this, that corporate R is declining, and as Pian's work showed, some of this is probably due to the pressures of global competition. Steve Freilich talked about short-termism in key industries such as material science. Important to note that startups are not picking up the slack. Ashish pointed that out very clearly. And as Steve Freilich pointed out, venture capital is also short-term oriented, so we don't get a focus on R as a consequence of venture capital. However, and this is a really important however, Ashish pointed this out and all of us agree, research is still critical, and that's just not simply our opinion. Although it is our opinion, it's the foundation for innovation. But also, as Ashish's research points out, corporate patents cite to this research. So they, too, consider this research essential. It's just simply that they don't want to do it themselves. But somebody's got to do it. And that's the problem, that we are not getting enough momentum in favor of doing it. So what to do? So, again, summarizing what has been said so far, we need government support of research. I think that is unequivocally true. It is clearly the case that current proposed budget cuts are going to be a terrible idea, or would be a terrible idea. But even beyond the current extreme situation, we need to think proactively about much better support of research, again, particularly in the physical sciences and engineering, where we have seen from history that there are so many spillover benefits to the economy as a whole. So that's one piece. Second piece, we need public-private partnerships to bridge the valley of death. Steve Freilich has emphasized that point, and that point can't be emphasized enough. Third, and this is something that was implicit in a lot of the presentations, but I want to highlight it because it's something that Senator Coons has been heavily involved with. We often think of research as taking place in the context of efforts that are divorced from manufacturing. Not true at all. Manufacturing innovation is critical, and manufacturing is a piece of the puzzle with respect to fundamental research. And in fact, in lots of different industries, manufacturing innovation is absolutely necessary. So Manufacturing USA, which Senator Coons mentioned that he has been instrumental in implementing, is a piece of the puzzle for solving manufacturing problems across different industries. One particular industry where this problem is very salient, and I've written about this in the past, I'm just delighted that an institute has been formed under the Manufacturing USA umbrella to solve this problem, is this problem of biologics manufacturing. We want faster, cheaper, better biologics, and the University of Delaware has just received a $70 million grant to build and sustain innovation focused on the manufacture of biopharmaceuticals. Obviously, research and manufacture co-located, as we've all discussed, is really important. The partners in this case include Amgen, Biogen, all the big companies one can think of. So public-private is absolutely essential in this context. Very quickly, since one of my areas of legal focus is intellectual property, I do want to note a couple of things about how intellectual property reform may or may not play a role. So historically, Congress has often looked to IP in times of competitiveness crises, if you will. So back in the late 70s, we thought we were losing the competition race to Japan, and we decided in that context to pass legislation known as the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 to promote patenting of U.S. federally funded research. We also created something called the Federal Circuit, which is an appeals court that hears all patent cases at the intermediate appellate level. In recent years, we've also seen lots of changes in the intellectual property system. So we've already talked about Senator Coons' Defend Trade Secrets Act, which I think is on balance a very good thing. More recently, though, there has been concern that the America Invents Act of 2011, which, full disclosure, I was involved with helping to push, maybe went too far in weakening patents. People have also been concerned that certain Supreme Court decisions on patentable subject matter have gone too far. I would say on the IP front, we should proceed with caution. It's obviously, IP is not the reason that we've had this bottoming out in terms of business research expenditure. That's been occurring since the late 80s, and if anything, most people would say until about 2010 or so, patents tended to be low quality and tended to be asserted in ways that were not useful for innovation. So I think we should proceed with caution on those fronts with respect to either changes that would roll back some of the work that was done in the American Invents Act, particularly the creation of the PTAB, the Patent Trial and Appeals Board, because I think on balance it's working as intended as a substitute for costly district court litigation on low-quality patents. And so that, it seems to me, is not a place we should think of as a legal reform arena. So this is just some data showing how basically the people who are petitioning at the PTAB are those who've been sued, often on low-quality patents. And so I don't think the PTAB changes are necessary at the legislative level. There's also been quite a bit of recent discussion about changing statutory language to address Supreme Court decisions on Section 101 of the patent statute, so-called patent-eligible subject matter. And we can go into this more in the Q&A if this is of interest. I do think perhaps this may be an issue for medical diagnostics, but in general, some of the legislative proposals that are floating around the Hill sweep far too broadly and would take us back to an era of low-quality business method type patents of the sort that the American Invents Act, through the installation of the PTAB, was intended to address. So that's a little bit of a diversion into IP, but in case that is a reaction that some people have with respect to potential legal reforms, I don't think that's the place where we should be focusing. So returning to the key policy conclusions, we need to strengthen public funding of foundational and translational research, and I would add manufacturing research to that list. And including through the very important mechanism of public-private partnerships. And so with that, I think we will get the panel up here.
Right. So let me introduce, or let me invite the panelists, please, to join us here at the on the dais here. And while they're coming up to the table, I just want to make a remark that economists, both theorists and empirical scholars alike, have understood now for more than 50 years that the invisible hand of purely private incentives will not work their magic when it comes to the conduct of research in the economy. And as we've seen from Ashish and supplemented by other arguments this afternoon. As public corporations have withdrawn from the conduct of the research over the past 30 years, that understanding of economists has become really all that much more true and that much more acute when we think about the future of the economy and economic growth, which depends on that underlying research. With that, why don't we open up the discussion to questions? I see a hand in the back. And why don't we do this? As you ask questions, if you could please identify yourself and any institutional affiliation you might have. Please.
Josh Sunoff, DePaul University. So I want to build up Steve Freilich concern for Ashish and for Arti. If the problem is short-term profit maximization and short-term venture exit, then you should see that in the data in a number of ways as a hypothesis that you can test. Those include the time from research to product development, the externalizing of other people using that research for other products, changes in the IP portfolio management, and in the later stage vertical integration by acquisition or merger. Okay? So I hope that you've already done that research. If not, I encourage you to do it. For Arti, if that's really the problem, particularly in a time of diminished support for progressive taxation, subsidies are really hard to maintain and to get at the level you want. But what you can do is differentiate tax reduction. So you can do it on two bases. For regard to the capital gains tax, you've already got people short and long term. You can just make the long term really long. And you can tie it more explicitly to basic science research. That's been done with that money. And similarly, in regard to product income or product sales, you can allow deductions for that kind of research. I think this is a much more powerful and much more appropriate way to try to go in this political climate. It also directly ties the norms of the business community on profit to the value that you're trying to achieve to get it from
Okay. There are, I guess, a couple of questions buried in there. Ashish and Arti, would you like to take a step?
I think the question of short-termism and so short-termism is used as a dirty word, and sometimes it's a good thing to be short-term. And for certain types of companies, if your pension funds were invested in those, you would want them to be short-term. So this is a complicated issue, and I think it's a rich one for research.
Okay. Arti, do you have?
So I think the capital gains tax issue is an interesting one, and I can't say that I have thought through all of the possibilities of requiring a longer holding period. I know that candidate Clinton had suggested that possibility in one of her platform proposals. I don't know whether it would necessarily be more politically palatable at this time than some of the other things that are not politically palatable. But putting aside political palatability, it's something that certainly is worth thinking about. I think the whole tax structure is not something that we focused on in this panel, but tax credits and the like are, it seems to me, a very important way of thinking about the problem, and perhaps more politically saleable than outright subsidies.
Right. And historically, tax credits, part of the rationale for those are the kinds of, if you will, market failure with regard to research that has been recognized for some time.
And
certainly.
Actually, one point that is worth, sorry to interrupt, was, in the orphan drug context, I think it's pretty clear that the tax credit is one of the key, whether one thinks that what's happened with respect to R&D and orphan drugs is socially welfare enhancing or not, it's clearly worked to incentivize R&D. And the tax credit has been a really, I think, underappreciated aspect. Most people have focused on the market exclusivity, but it's actually the tax credit that's been much more important.
Great, good. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, my name is Saeed Jahanmir. I'm on the staff of Manufacturing Caucus with Congressman Tim Ryan is the co-chair. I have a question for you, Dr. Shu. First of all, I've read many of the papers from MIT and your excellent, and you show the graph of Germany with respect to manufacturing position and how Germany's position has been relatively stable with respect to manufacturing, whereas U.S. has dropped and China has picked up. Do you know why? What did Germany do to protect itself from China? Or what did they do to protect themselves and basically have no job losses in manufacturing and no loss of their economy? That would be a very interesting example for us to learn from.
Pian, please.
I'm not sure about the evidence of whether manufacturing hasn't declined in Germany. So the graph I showed is a share of world exports. That hasn't changed. So I can't speak to that direct evidence, unfortunately, because I don't recall them off the top of my head. But there is some evidence on how the Chinese competition affected European firms differently from the U.S. firms. So there is a fairly recent paper that came out using European data, so not just Germany, but UK, et cetera. And they found that in textile and chemical industries, the European firms that faced more competition from China actually increased their innovation and IT spending, conditional on survival. So the competition wiped out some of the, relatively poor performing firms, but conditional on survival, the surviving firms had increased innovation. So why don't we see that in the U.S. and also not in Canada? So the empirical, another news working paper using Canadian data found the same evidence as we found in the U.S., which is that increasing competition lead to declining patenting, specifically in process innovations. So part of the reason, I think, is that the nature of the shock is a little bit different. So in the U.S., it's a very strong, unexpected shock, whereas in Europe, the degree of the competition, the degree of the import competition shock is not as strong. And the second is that it also depends on the starting level of how much competition there is in the market. So in the U.S., the competitive stats suggest that the U.S. industries are generally more competitive than European industries. So if you start in a place where it's not very competitive, then a little bit of extra competition can be very helpful for incentives to innovate. Because if you're not in a competitive state and you have a little bit of competition, it gives you incentives to innovate and as a way to escape competition. Whereas if you already have a lot of competition and then it becomes a lot more competitive, then it's much harder to escape competition through innovation, and seems like the option is to kind of just drop out. So the nature of the competition is very different. And also, and related to competition, but the co-location aspect, the way I think offshoring of European companies is like, they're offshore to Asia, but also to Eastern Europe, right? And that distance is a lot closer than China versus U.S. So that could also explain that how, the way globalization and trade shocks affected European companies are different from U.S. and North American companies.
May I add one point to that? I think another thing that has been done in Europe, particularly in Germany, is the public-private relationship between the Fraunhofer Institutes and industry, the way that's funded, the way that's used, and it's designed around specific industries, exactly as the professor said, where the competition basis is still sound. And it helps to enhance it, it helps to think ahead, because the inevitable competition can lead to innovation or it can lead to death, and it's a decision. And the better you plan through having the basic foundations that you need and the relationships to take those science foundations into innovations and ultimately into the market is going to determine the success rate.
And if I can add to that, Steve, mind you, the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany are organized on a very different basis than the way tech transfer under the auspices of Bayh-Dole and related legislation have led to the organization of that interaction in the U.S. So, and that it's something that's very interesting and perhaps an institutional innovation that the U.S. would be well advised to themselves adopt here.
Not the least of which is the co-location aspect of it.
Absolutely, and there are other aspects having to do with the incentives of the staff and within the Fraunhofers as well. Very interesting. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sujesh Shirokumar from the National Academy's Board on Science, Technology, and Economic Policy. So I'm sort of hearing two models that are sort of being mixed in somewhat of the discussion here. One is sort of the linear model of innovation, which is underlying a lot of the statistics on inputs into research and so forth. And that picture says that we should be worried. The other picture that I'm seeing is sort of a more ecosystem model of innovation. And there's a lot of talk about partnerships and other types of multi-dimensional relationships. And first of all, do we have some measures of how robust or how growing this part of this aspect of the innovation picture is? And would understanding that cause us to worry perhaps a little less?
Okay. Ashish, and then if you want to even comment on some work that we did before.
Why don't you?
Okay, well, Ashish, Ashish and I actually did a study on what might be called the Division of Innovative Labor. We published this in just 2016. We surveyed, we received responses from about 6,500 firms for the manufacturing sector. Our data was representative, fairly representative. Bottom line, and the question is to what extent do corporations, when they, in their introductions of, say, new products to the market, to what extent do the underlying inventions come from outside those corporations? This speaks to the issue of the division of labor. We were quite surprised to learn through this survey 49%. So this ecosystem that you've talked about is extremely important, and what that means is that the innovative performance of the economy just doesn't depend on the existence of startups or large firms or whatever kind of firm you want, but the relationships. It's a systemic it's a systemic process that's very important, this ecosystem that you point to. Then let's bring it back home to what we just talked about in the panel today, which is this division of innovative labor, okay, this ecosystem, making up for the gap that Ashish with co-authors Sharon Bellanzone and Andrea Pediconi have highlighted in the work that they presented. Ashish spoke to that a little bit, and the other speakers did as well. The point is no. Okay, that certainly government contributions, research, which is the major support for university research, has that been active, particularly in life sciences? Sure, but has it made up for this gap? In no way has that happened. And as Steve Merrill pointed out, there are even compositional issues there that should be paid attention to. And then you would think, so it's the startups and it's the VCs that will save us. And we heard again from the panel today that no, that's not the case. So we have declining private support for research in the nation, and public support is not filling the breach. So I think even from the perspective of this ecosystem, of this feedback, this nonlinear model, if you will, there's something to pay attention to here, and certainly in the world of policy issues that should be seriously considered for the future economic growth of the nation.
And could I just quickly add a couple of our results that I didn't discuss in the presentation? The first one is that our main results look at the impact on U.S. Big firms, and we also have additional results looking at the impact on smaller U.S. firms, as well as university patenting. So those are not at the firm level because we couldn't match the firms, but I'll skip the details. What we find is that even if you include the U.S. corporate patents, regardless of large and small firms, you find the same results, which is an industry that experienced more import competition, experienced decline in patenting. Interestingly, that's not true for university patents. So non-corporate patents, we don't see that trend, which means that this association is not driven by some kind of technological trends, where you could argue that maybe some technological areas experience a decline in opportunities, and therefore firms go out to, looking for import competition. Looking for imports, and that's not true. So that's not happening. And so that's this competition effect that we find is specific to corporate patenting.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions, please, from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you, Congressional Budget Office. A question for Steve Merrill. You've identified a big increase in life science funding and stability or fall off in computing, mechanical engineering. I was curious whether some of that increase in life sciences could be providing indirectly funding for, say, computer R&D, since so much research, say, in genomics or neuroscience relies on high-powered computing processing.
Well, the first answer is that computer science is sort of an outlier as far as the physical sciences and engineering are concerned. So it's done better, but as I emphasized, from a relatively small base. Yes, NIH could and is supporting developments in computer science and IT, but to a relatively small extent compared to other federal agencies. So yes, it's. But these figures are figures for research fields, not agencies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you. Other questions? I had a question for Steve. Oh, there is a question. Great. In the back, please. Go ahead.
Comment on the ecosystem that brings it back to Steve Freilich's point again, which is that trade secrecy increases the level of tacit knowledge, and therefore the search costs to identify the labor that you want to get is increasingly high. And similarly, the additional enforcement of non-competes make it really difficult to transfer the knowledge. That's why you can't substitute.
Good. Yes, Sharon Belenson.
Just a quick question, Steve. If Ashish is right, and the right way to organize innovation is to let universities do research, and if you are right as well, saying that to do that, to kind of benefit from universities, we need to hire some scientists to learn and kind of censor what is being done outside. How many scientists do you think one should hire in order to kind of pay for you? And obviously, we don't need the whole experimental lab. How many? Like 200 scientists, 20?
I appreciate the question. I think it's an impossible one to answer because it has to do with the strategy that you're trying to implement. You can't say if I have 600 scientists, they will be twice as productive as 300 scientists if they're pursuing a strategy of innovation that's a flawed one. And that I think is part of the challenge that corporate America faces today as they inherit an existing infrastructure of scientists ostensibly driving innovation, but it may not be properly designed for the effort that they want to undertake. The fallacy then, though, is that you can go to the other extreme and you can say, well, I've now got 600. I only need 50 because only 50 are productive. Well, that's an impossible equation to actually make work out. What you have to do is literally look at what you're trying to accomplish, identify the skills that you need, identify what the outside competitive and supportive capability is around that, and bring in what you need or train what you have to be able to accomplish the goals that you've set out. I've actually participated in starting an entire new business for DuPont where we didn't have the capability internally to do the science, but we had the manufacturing capability if we could draw that connection. So we had to hire people, but it didn't take 100. It took 15, and we got that done.
Great. Very.
For what scale? I mean, so because these numbers, 15 out of, like, is there a denominator here? How should I think?
It depends on whether you're trying to do percentages or not.
I get it.
If you're looking at the absolutes of what you need.
How big was the business if it's not going to, in annual revenues?
All businesses start small.
No, but sort of in 15 to support a business of what size?
It would have been a product line of 3 distinct products that were all headed towards the same value chain. But the key thing is...
No, I meant dollars.
Yeah, I don't have that number. I left before I could get those dollar figures. But the key thing is that if you have the manufacturing capability in place and your R&D is now designed to be able to connect the market need to the manufacturing that you have with new science that you're bringing in, it actually gives you a real leg up on being able to be strategic and accomplish the goal.
Great. Good. Other questions in back and then in front. So in back, please.
My question is...
Name and affiliation.
Jimmy Sumbai, I am a policy fellow at the office of Senator Amy Klobuchar. The question is related to applied research and also basic research. This has 2 parts. The main part is, what is the balance, for example, in relation to, for the government, to invest more in applied research or basic research? Is there a such balance or not? Because depending on the also innovation accelerate. And the other question is related in the panel is, you talk about research in general, but most of the decline, I wonder, and also is being in applied research, is being in basic research, and which one has more influence in innovation?
Okay.
You want me to take it? So there's sort of, if you look at the NSF numbers, they do distinguish between basic and applied. I'm happy to if there are folks from NSF. My understanding is that the distinction between basic and applied in the NSF numbers is much less reliably measured consistently than if you just look at research versus development. So that's one. We could look at the evidence we have on publications and look at where the publications come in. Do they come in more basic journals or more applied journals? And you could do it. Again, this is not an easy thing to do. You could look at impact factor, right? So if you think general interest journals have higher impact factor, the short answer there is most of the decline that we see in corporate publications is in the basic research side, or the more basic journals. That's where you see the decline, not in the more applied. Those are the facts. What the right balance is, I'll leave it to my superiors to say.
And I'll leave it to my superiors. That's a hard problem to, as I think you already understand, to really put a number to. Certainly, I think what we can say is that we're probably not at the right balances, or our expectation. But would others like to speak to that very difficult question? There was another question right in front here, please. I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to make one point, which is that I think that in terms of at least the presentation this panel is making, including Ashish, what we're all more concerned about is R versus D,
right.
and R is in general is an area of great concern, whether basic or applied, and so the fact is that it's hard to draw distinctions, but that entire area is a problem.
Okay, 3 rows back, then next 2 rows back, please. Go ahead.
Minister responsible for science and innovation at the German Embassy. Thanks for mentioning the Fraunhofer model. I would like to raise the question about who can fill the gap. You were mentioning
venture capital and startups as probably not being able to fill the gap. What about the states? What about philanthropy? You hear a lot of things that can come from philanthropy. And may there be a shock for companies as well if they see the budget figures that they will again start to invest in R&D because they can no longer rely on public money?
Yeah. Steve, go ahead.
So states are important, but a very small proportion of research funding. They would fall in the category of own institution funds that I showed. Their predominant field of research is biomedical, just like philanthropy is. So it's, again, an even greater imbalance.
And if I can take the last part of your question, the point is that the lags are enormous between the conduct of upstream research and its material benefits in the marketplace. Indeed, what an article published in 1990 was quite nice by Jim Adams, showing the lags of what he considered for his purposes basic research, and that study showed lags on the order of 20 years. So the point is by pulling down funding now, we're doing something that's probably in any meaningful way, irreversible in many of its effects. And so, given those very long lags, we need to pay attention now because that's not a problem that's easily fixed down the road. Please.
Actually, before we go on, I'm sorry. There's one other important point, which is we tend to think about the Valley of Death as being a cliff that you fall off on, never to climb back out again. There are some incremental bridges that can be built, and there was an important study done. I believe the author was Sabrina Howell, where she showed that at the right time, with an injection of about $150,000 in materials innovation in the energy space, you can do a world of good that maybe later on $1 million wouldn't help with.
Great. Good. Please, in front.
Good afternoon. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of a company called Segero's International Group. We focus on startups and innovation in manufacturing. Looking at your research, you mentioned about China, you're talking about Germany. How do we put the international researchers looking at the actual innovation and research together so that we can exchange the ideas, or is only making America great? Because eventually we will come in and the other companies and countries will come in. Like I have had so many Germans come in on innovation, on manufacturing, on startup. So how do we make that international and global area on looking at financing, investment, and other things?
Does anybody want to take it? I'm not sure. So the question is then, I'm not exactly sure what the precise question is.
It's a question and a comment. How do we bring in the international researchers into what we are doing, innovation, manufacturing, and looking at maybe an international company or corporation could say, yes, I'll fund the research. If I fund the research or finance the research, could you refuse because it's not American company?
I see. I see. Okay.
Knowing what I know about American universities, we would not refuse money from anybody.
Yes, and I would absolutely endorse that observation. So I think would not be a
one
problem.
interesting
But go ahead.
observation is that I think Chinese startups have been the recipients on the beneficiary side of international innovation. So there are a lot of companies, like for a period in time, for the Chinese internet companies, the model is, copy after the successful U.S. firm. And obviously you have a ton of copycats, but, one person is going to get lucky and they're going to be, doing very well in the Chinese internet space. I think that model is not probably as prevalent now as before. Interestingly, I can't think of a counterexample from the U.S. side, which is a U.S. company copying a Chinese internet company and doing well in the U.S. I can't think of that, but there are many examples on the Chinese side.
Great. And yes, please.
Yes, my name is James. Pardon me, I'm with the American Heritage Insurance Corporation. And I just wanted to bring up something that I was listening for but I didn't hear it, the impact of future workforce. If you decline investment in research, then you decline the ability to teach the workforce that will be coming down the line. Because with the rapid changes in the innovation globally, the student that's coming as a freshman today needs to be taught by people who are already looking 5, 6, 10 years ahead. But I just wanted you guys to comment on that because I haven't heard anything specific on that.
Steve, I think you spoke to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think your comment in itself is the wisdom of the group. So thank you. One of the things that I think is going to be extremely helpful here is not to think about these disciplines as pure disciplines. One of the things that you see is mathematicians starting to evolve into, as opposed to going into the fields of math or modeling, going into the financial sector. I think one of the ways that you break that trend out of the science and into the finance world is by recognizing the multi and interdisciplinary nature of the world that we live in today and beginning to tailor the education that way. It becomes much more attractive to students, and it also becomes attractive to industry as well, because now they can become part of that learning process that's starting at the universities and has a real home in industry.
Okay. Steve?
I just want to say a word about the workforce issue. So it depends on what aspect of the technical workforce you're talking about. If you're talking about the skilled but non-baccalaureate technical workforce, I refer you to a report that just came out of the STEP board at the Academy on that subject. If you're talking about the graduate level and PhD technical workforce, then there's a very close correspondence between federal spending in those fields and the number of people being trained. And that's simply because we support graduate education predominantly through research associate positions.
Great. We have time, I gather, for maybe just one more question, and then we're going to have to call it. You've had your hand up for a few moments.
I wanted to ask about this idea of optimality. I mean, we talked about it a little bit. So first off, my name is Will Reinhardt. I work for a think tank here in D.C. called the American Action Forum. I do a lot of research in this space as well. One of the things that I was very surprised last time I saw the 2015 numbers come out of NSF is that essentially it really hasn't changed all that much. When you do break out the research and development, you look at, say, the 1950s, it's right around 30%, and today it's a little higher, like 36%. So I'm wondering, and especially now when you actually look at as a percentage of GDP, that we're actually at about all-time high levels. I'm just wondering what I mean, we haven't really talked about this idea of optimality, but I'm just wondering what specifically what numbers should we actually be looking for when we're talking about a percentage, or what types of statistics should we be trying to understand? Because, we talk about patentability, that's kind of, it's, again, Arti said a little bit of information about the problems of that. I know a lot of people have said there's issues with trying to do this percentage of our GDP. What kinds of data do we need? And similarly, what kinds of things that should we be directed to be looking for? Because everyone says there's a problem. When I look at the data, there doesn't seem to be a huge dramatic, I mean, there are shifts clearly, but the data doesn't show this huge dramatic problem that we need to solve.
I'm not sure what you're referring to when you say 30%.
When you look at R&D as a percentage, the changes haven't,
Percent. What's your denominator?
What's your denominator?
When you say 30%.
When you look at R&D as compared, so when you look at R and D as just a percentage of all R&D, and you look at what their changes have been over time, I mean, this is the problem with the NSF numbers, is I know that there's this real delineation between the two, but when you look at the percentage between R and then D, it doesn't seem they changed all that much over the last.
Ashish, what do you want to say?
So you're right. If you look at the very long term, there's a kind of an inverted U, and we peak around some late 70s, maybe mid 80s, or even 90s, and since then we've been declining dramatically. So I'm of two minds. One way is the 1950s were very different, right? America had, if you look at the state of American universities in the 1950s to where we are now, there's been a massive expansion of American research capability. In 1950, arguably, Europe was much closer, in many cases far ahead of U.S. research capability, which is not the case now. So today, in that sense, I don't think 1950 is a fair comparison. If you compare with 1980s, for example, it's been a steady down. The share of research has steadily declined. I'm thinking specifically now about private in the private sector, but it may well be also in the public sector.
Right. Yes.
Steve's data show that. Yeah.
Good. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today, and I'd like to thank the panelists as well for their presentations. And thank you.